Alright, so we have something a little different today. Inside this box is a camera. It's actually a Polaroid land camera, and I know it says Model 800, but inside the box this is a 150. Polaroid, everybody knows about Polaroid, instant film, that's been a big thing. And then land camera, a lot of people don't know this. The reason these are called land cameras is because they're named after the guy who invented them, which was this dude called Eugene Land. So, fun fact, land camera, because that's the guy who made it. If we open up this box, you'll see this is kind of a stock standard land camera. Little different with this video. I had made an original clip kind of talking about this camera when I first got it before I modified stuff on it. Long story short, lost that video, made all these changes, so now we're just going to start from here. So this isn't really a stock land camera anymore. Anybody who kind of knows about Polaroid film will understand right away what the difference is. So what I did with this camera is I actually added a winder knob and made some other changes. So instead of shooting the standard Polaroid film that this camera would have shot, and obviously that film isn't made anymore, so this camera wasn't very useful, but I took that and converted this to shoot 120 roll film, which some of our other cameras shoot. The great thing about this camera, and the whole reason I wanted to convert it, is because it actually has rangefinder capability. So you can see you have your viewing slide here, your viewing window, and then these two windows here are actually for the rangefinder. So as you focus this camera, which is done by this dial on the back, there's actually a view window here, and similar to a lot of other rangefinders, there is a ghost image and then a main image, and you use that to focus. So what you get is a camera that shoots 120 format, and in the case of this too, it shoots about a 6 wide by about a little over a 9 centimeter image. So you get bigger than a 6x9, so you get a really cool panoramic image. But like I said, had an original clip I shot talking about this before I made these modifications. Lost that video, so now we're back here. So consider this kind of the intro clip, and the clips I'm going to show next are just kind of me tearing into this camera and making the changes that I need to, or that I needed to make to this camera to make it work the way I wanted it to. And also there's a lot of trial and error. So here's the intro clip, and everything you'll see from here on is kind of the build up to how I turn this camera into what is a functioning 120 film rangefinder camera.
Alright, so the next thing we're going to have to do, now that we know where we want our film to sit, is we're going to have to work on the spool and then the take-up for the film. So as we pull it across here, we're going to need a way to advance the film to the next frame, and as well as have something to hold the spool of unshot film in place. So a big part of that is going to be having a spool to sit in here, which in the case of this, we actually have an old Polaroid spool that sits in some pre-existing grooves. So we're definitely going to try to work on that, once again just keeping it simple without having to modify it too much. But the big thing about that is that we're going to need some kind of hand knob or some kind of crank to manually be able to turn and advance the film, because as these Polaroid cameras came, they actually didn't have an advance knob. You actually pulled your strip of film out from this side of the camera, and that's how you advanced your frames. So one of the big modifications to this camera is going to be basically adding a winder knob to the top on this side. And that's kind of what I've gone with. I toyed around a little bit on what would be the best location to add a winder knob to. Obviously, this side of the camera really isn't good because here you have your rangefinder and your view side. And then on the bottom, there's really a lot working on there with the hinge and the way it sits. And also this opening was a little too wide to constrain and hold the film in place. So I basically settled on using this side. And there's two trains of thought. I could either put the knob at the bottom through the hard case of this, which I really liked how this camera kind of sat nice and level in its put together form, and how this flat bottom was used with the tripod mount. So right now what I've decided to go with, and what we're going to kind of move forward with, is going to be taking and putting a knob through this top section here and then mating it up with where that film spool currently sits. So that's going to be how we move forward with that. And once again, I've seen this done on the internet. They've done it many ways. I've seen it done with the knob on the bottom, with the knob on the top. And I've seen them use, hardware supplies or, bolts and then cutting and slotting bolts to be able to kind of meet up with a film adapter. And I have a rule, or at least a motto, and I say that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So when I was looking into this, I said, okay, I need a winder knob. And what better way to find a winder knob than to kind of go and piece through donor cameras. So what I have here are two cameras that I just had sitting around. Both of these cameras are non-functioning. This one was missing a lot of the front elements in the lens, which just made it non-working. And it's just a basic Kodak Pony 135 camera, nothing too special, something that kind of just was in a bin of other cameras, so it's pretty much up for grab for parts. And then I have this Yashica SLR. This unfortunately had some shutter issues and some cocking issues, and has since just kind of been torn down and torn apart, and it's basically for parts. But what I'm hoping is that out of these two cameras I can salvage some parts that we can use for the winder knob and maybe internal holders for this new camera. So what we'll do is kind of tear these down, see if we can pull some pieces out and make something work. Alright, so we can get started on pulling these apart. Both of these are already a little disassembled already, just from me kind of pulling them apart just to see how they work or just to try other projects. But I'm really hoping that there will be some useful pieces out of this. I have a lot of hope actually on this guy. I think these winder knobs will really work well for what I have in mind. But the only way to find out is to kind of disassemble these and see what useful parts we can pull. Alright, so did a little deconstruction there, and I think we have a pretty good candidate here. These two wind and rewind levers came out of that Kodak Pony camera, and I really like these. One, because this one actually has the take-up sprocket here, and it has kind of a nice feedback, and the thickness I think should match up pretty well with what we're looking at for our camera here. So I really like just the depth that sits at. I feel like that's going to give me about the reach I need in through the top of that body. And also, I mean, they really just look like something that would almost belong on that camera, which is really cool. So we have two options here. This one, obviously a little different. We kind of have a square piece to interface with, which is nice if we're going a different direction, because obviously we don't know how we're going to kind of contact with that spool, if we're going to take this Polaroid spool and modify it, or if we're going to take maybe a 120 spool and find a way to adapt something like this to a 120 spool. So definitely some options there. Alright, so checking back in here, we've made basically all the modifications we need to right now to our land camera. The biggest thing you'll notice on the outside is basically just adding the winding knob to advance the film. Otherwise, this camera looks very much stock from the outside. However, if we take and flip open the back, you can see that we basically have added spacers so we can keep that 120 film roll centered on the unexposed side. And then for the exposed sides here, we just basically have a modified Polaroid spool that kind of attaches up to our new winder that we drilled through. And then in lieu of drilling a hole through the back plate so you can read the numbers, which in this case, because this is kind of a weird frame size, the numbers don't line up, we just kind of worked out a reference point here. And then from that reference point at the start, we basically know that 2.5 turns on the winder will give you a new frame. So a little crude, but
really kind of what we're going for right now in this kind of R&D test phase. I don't know if I'll like the way this turns out, if the way that the film take-up will work, if this winder will work. So we'll just start here as this kind of an R&D, and we'll go actually ahead and put a roll of film in and do some test shots and see how this turns out. Alright, so we've got our film on the take-up spool. We got it placed in here now. To kind of start this, we're going to put this back plate over and just start advancing. And by turning that wheel, we're going to advance the film onto the film back anyway. And by doing that, we're basically going to use this reference to this roller for our start point against this film, being we don't have a window cut out in the back, because since this is kind of a modified camera, we're basically working with a film size that really doesn't correlate to the numbers on the back of the film, if you're familiar with 120 at all. Those numbers being, I believe, 4.5 by 6. And then you have your 6 by 6, and then you usually have a 6 by 9 number. So we're going to roll to the 2 here, and we're just going to go one line past this 2 here. So we'll roll to this one, and we'll roll right to that middle part. And that kind of lines up with our test roll here, where we found out if we roll to basically that mark between the last 2 for the 6 by 6 in there, we end up with pretty much on our first frame. So with that done, we'll swing the back shut and lock it down. There we go. Now we're ready to go out and shoot. Alright, hey everyone. So I realized in this video so far I've been doing a lot of talking about how I'm building this camera, but I really haven't done a lot of talking about why I'm building this camera. One of the main reasons is right now I shoot a lot of 4x5. And 4x5 is great. You get really great quality, a really large negative to work with. But the 4x5 I have, which is a Crown Graphic, is really kind of slow and bulky. You have to do your focusing, load in the film back, and then you're able to shoot, which is great if you have a lot of time. But sometimes when you're chasing around little dudes, it's a lot harder to take that time to compose and set up a shot. And really, a lot of the photography I like doing is grabbing stuff on the fly when the moment strikes and kind of living in that moment. And a lot of times with 4x5, stopping to, focus and compose a shot and then load a film back, not really the easiest thing to do. So I was hoping that by doing this, I could get a larger image size and still retain just a range focus, or basically a rangefinder focus, and just shoot a little faster and still get that good image quality. So we're walking to the park right now, and we're going to try some test shots, burn through a roll on this guy, and see how that turns out. So maybe we'll grab a few shots at the park, and then, like every other video, we will check back at the end and have some images scanned in, and we kind of show how that looks and how it turns out. Hopefully it turns out good. We are working with the second roll of film from the Polaroid land camera to 120 film conversion. The first roll, went and developed it, had some light leak issues, mainly from human error, just some tricks of trying to figure out how to load and unload the film into that camera, being that was the first roll I ever put through there. So went and developed that, saw those light leaks. This is the second roll, kind of changed some things around, switched some things. So we're going to develop this here right now, see if there are any light leak issues that are possibly from the camera body, or if the light leak issues from the first time around were purely human error.
So we'll rush through this developing here, and once we're done with that, we'll kind of show, first of all, the initial roll that had some of those light leak issues and kind of explain what that was from and how that happens. And then hopefully we'll have a good set of images from the second test roll. And we can also kind of talk about just any future ideas for the camera or anything else that I want to kind of tweak after learning from this roll, and then move forward with it. The one thing I can say is shooting with the Polaroid camera, and really all it is a rangefinder. It's a 120 format film rangefinder camera, which in terms of different cameras and styles, I think rangefinder is something I've always gravitated toward as far as a camera type. So it's really fun having kind of a larger panoramic 120 format camera that is a rangefinder. I mean, the whole reason I made this conversion was I wanted a rangefinder camera, and I wanted to do it on the cheap, or at least on a budget, which, when all in, I mean, I paid a whole $10 off eBay for the Polaroid land camera, and all of the parts and pieces that I used and modified the camera with were free that I had lying around. So, I mean, really a low cost for what ultimately equates to a pretty decent kind of panoramic 120 camera. But we'll talk about that a little later. First, let's get through the rest of this developing, and then we'll start looking at images. Alright, so film is back. Again, kind of the same issue on the second roll as the first roll. You can see there's definitely some light leaks on the edges of the film, which is kind of these kind of veins reaching in you're seeing. So that's kind of disheartening. Strangest thing though is you can see they kind of go through the entirety of the film, all except for the first shot here, or in this case this would have been the last shot on the roll. No light leaks, no real issues, and you kind of pace back through the rest of it, and it seems like there's kind of this light leak issue. My thought in my head right now, in the fact that it's kind of liney, it might actually be a shutter issue with the lens on this camera. Perhaps the shutter is just sticking open, or there's some issue there where there's a light leak around it. But as you can see, pretty bad. And then there's somewhere it's not so bad. So right now it's kind of a frustration because it's a little inconsistent. But I suppose what we'll do is we will scan this film in, kind of compare this first roll to the second roll. And, you know, this is the part of building something new. It's figuring out what's working and what's not working. So we're going to have to figure out what's not working and see how we can make this camera work for us. So let's jump over to the computer and the scanner and get a closer look at what's going on here. So we're back down here and we have our Polaroid land camera 120 film conversion. So like I said before, looking at the two rolls of test film we've put through here, there's been some light leak issues. So kind of popped it open. At first I thought maybe it had something to do with the light seals on the inside of here. But on closer inspection I found the real root of the problem. So turn the light on. We'll zoom in here a little bit and see if we can show it. So when I modified this camera, I took some parts of it out, and as you can see, yeah, look at that shine through. So basically I took off a bracket here, and in the time from when I took that bracket off to when I kind of finished up the camera, it completely escaped my mind that those holes actually passed all the way through the body of the camera. So as we were taking and pulling film across that section, anytime it was held up to the light, it was basically just doing three separate, or actually four separate exposures, because there's 1, 2, 3 tapped holes and then a clearance hole. So basically we're just exposing the film every time. And that made sense because we kind of had these consistent like marks that kind of made sense for advancing the film, like little cranks. So really, the good news in all this is it's an easy fix. In fact, bear with me here a second. There you go. Fixed. That's simple. It's part of the fun of all this. You know, if everything worked right the first time, where would I guess, the adventure in the whole thing be? Who wants to build, you know, or modify a camera and have everything work perfectly? I mean, it sure would be nice, but at the same time, it's kind of more fun to, I don't know, have a creative process to it, or just have little tasks to overcome. So, the fun news of this is, now, we have this thing set up and ready to go. So really the next step will be to put test roll 3 through there and see if that little cover up of tape, and obviously I'll fix it a little better than just a piece of black electrical tape, but we'll kind of check to and make sure there's no other light leaks. But I think for the most part this should be good, so hopefully test roll number 3 will be a good clean roll and we'll have some awesome images to see from it. Alright, so it's been a little bit, but we are back with the Polaroid land camera. Made a few more adjustments and fixes to this. So what we've done is we took the film spool, or the film winder that we had off that donor camera, and we ended up mounting it on our land camera here. So pretty simple how we did that is we just basically kind of found the center point of this, marked it up, and then drilled a hole. So if we take this off of here quick, because all it is one retaining screw, and then we pull off the winder head, and then our little spindle falls right out. So, like we said before, it's just our little spindle, and then we simply just drilled a hole right through the top. And if we flip it around to the reverse side, you can see we kind of had to just put kind of a chamfer on the back side of this hole, and that was to clear the spindle. So you can see with that spindle in there, the end of it sat a little bigger than the initial kind of collar that was in there. So just by drilling a simple hole through there, now we had a way to advance our film. And then the beauty of using a piece that existed out of another camera was that everything kind of just fits together well. The trickiest part of this whole thing was kind of figuring out that it was the right distance to work with the thickness of the top plate on this camera. And truth be told, it could have been a little longer, because what happened is, like we said, we had to kind of take away some material from the top half of this to be able to fit this in here and still let it turn freely. So that's a big part of it right there, is that we now have a way to advance our film. But the issue we face is with a normal 120 film reel, you have a much different interface. It's more of a blade, whereas here on a 35mm film spool case, which is what we pulled this out of, you're dealing with kind of these recessed pieces here. So if you put these side by side, you can see that there's a little bit of a difference in how you engage both of these film spools. So using a 120 roll was out of the question there, mainly because of the width or the height of it, and then the way it interfaced with the winder we got. So the next thing I had to work with was the actual original Polaroid spool that came with this camera. And the same there, this actually used to have both sides with just this non-geared kind of
idler, because like we said before, you used to actually work these cameras by taking and pulling your strip out from this side, and that's how you advance your film. So what we had to do was actually just, for kind of a test purpose or proof of concept, we just took and actually milled down the end of this piece here. So it used to look like this, and we took and milled it down like this and just basically put a blade to it so it would fit into our camera. And as you can see, it's not the prettiest thing in the world, but it got the job done, and it allowed us to kind of test and figure out what worked and what didn't, as far as like light leaks and just film spooling in general. So this was kind of phase one of it. One of the downsides to this were that when you load film onto it, eventually, as you would load film on, you'd actually have kind of open gaps. Oops. Focus. You actually have open gaps on either side, which when you have film there, if you were to take this out and expose it in daylight, you actually have light leaking in to the ends of your film leads there. And on a couple of the test shots I have, you can see that, where light's actually leaking into the side of it and causing a little bit of a flare here and there. So that's something I wanted to address. Obviously also this, as I drop it, was just a temporary fix, having this piece just kind of whittled down here. So what I did was employed a little bit of 3D drafting, and kind of made the best of both worlds. So I made a 3D model, kind of an amalgamation, or yeah, basically amalgamation of a 120 film spool. As far as the distance, I looked and said, okay, what's the stock distance on a 120 film spool? Went and copied that, and then went and copied the exact dimensions of what the film spool looks like for a 35 millimeter film cassette. So you can see that there. Kind of just copied that as well. And then had to take that overall length from that original Polaroid spool that we cut down, and then just kind of took all those things and copied them together. And what we came up with was this guy here. So like I said, I designed this myself, kind of just drew it up on the computer, sent it off to an online company called 3D Hubs, and there you basically just send off a CAD file and they will give you a cost to print it, and then they'll basically print it and ship it to you. So I had them print up a couple of these, and I mean, look at that. Fits perfectly. And now we have the best of both worlds, because we have a nice proper engagement of that 35 millimeter film spool head. We have the right distance for our 120 film to sit in here, where it's still covered up on both sides so you don't have light leaks. And then our distance is right because we still sit down into this bottom film spool. So it's not a perfect design. Honestly, if there's a few things I'd change, there'd be things to be done. But for the most part, we end up with a really nice design here. And it kind of fits really well with this camera. One more thing I did is, when I was testing out this camera originally with this spool, the thickness on this guy was a little much. And what happened is, as you got toward the end of a roll, the film would actually bind with this inside plate here, because there just wasn't enough room for it to wrap up, because the inner diameter of the core was so much that it started to actually exceed kind of the outside ring here. So when I created this one as well, I actually thinned down the diameter on this core versus the original Polaroid core to hopefully prevent that binding. So the whole process of this has just kind of been test, and repeat. So it's been kind of fun, because every time we've done something, we've found little issues or little things that needed fixing, and then we've addressed them. So the same with the light leaks and the initial mounting of our winder knob were just things where we kind of did trial and error, then playing around with this film spool, figuring out what worked, and then, actually creating our own 3D printed film spool to work with this camera. We're at a pretty good point with it now. I'm going to put another roll of film through with this new 3D printed film roll. Hopefully that goes well. And that'll be the fourth roll through this camera now. So it's kind of exciting. It's been a pretty long process with a couple breaks in between. Obviously the time to, create a part like this, draw it up, and then kind of go through some iterations too. When I originally drew this up, I didn't just come up to this design immediately. I kind of had a few different ideas saying, oh, well, maybe I just want to, keep this spool different, or maybe I want to, go with a different type of piece down here, or maybe this doesn't need to be a solid piece. So it's kind of fun, just the whole process we've gone through. And really the great part is when the whole process is done, it'll have been fun in a scientific sense, and I'll also have a working rangefinder camera that shoots 120 film. So pretty excited about both of those things in a prospect of just having a nice working camera, and that I have kind of had a fun way to go about creating it too. So like I said, I think what we're going to do is load up a fourth roll of film in this camera, run it, and then we'll show those images, and hopefully that'll be kind of the end of this, barring that our 3D printed film roll works well. So yeah, without anything else going on, let's look at the last set of images from this thing and kind of put a wrap on it. Alright guys, so some final thoughts on this whole camera project. Overall, I'm really pleased with how this turned out. My objective was to create a large format, 120 film camera that had rangefinder focusing capabilities, so I could do quick snapshot style images, and have that nice quality that you get with a 120 camera with that larger film plane. And really, that camera does this really well. The one thing that I'm still working on with this camera after fixing the light leak issues and creating the film spool would be just the film advancement, because like I mentioned earlier in the video, it relies on just doing 2.5 turns on the film advance knob. And sometimes you don't get those full 2.5 turns, so you end up with overlapping images. Or in some cases, you don't advance the film knob after you take a picture, and then you pick it up in a couple days and you don't know if you took a shot or not, so you don't advance it, and then you end up double exposing your images. But the images that I did take correctly with this camera, I'm really pleased with. For this being an older camera and an older lens, the resolution on it is really great. I really like the sharpness and the detail that I got with my test shots. Obviously, there will be some changes with this. I think, like I said, the big thing is going to be the film advance knob. But for now, I'm really excited about how this project turned out, and I can't wait to do more stuff like this. So I'll see you guys later.